In the vast graveyard of history where the bones of great empires lie, the causes of death are usually violent. We think of Rome burning as the barbarians breached the gates. We think of Napoleon's grand army freezing in the Russian snow. We think of the Spanish Armada splintering against the rocks. We are conditioned to believe that superpowers end with a bang, with a dramatic military defeat that signals to the world that the old order is dead and a new one has begun. But the British Empire, the largest dominion in human history, the empire on which the sun never set, did not die on a battlefield. It did not lose a war to a rival army. It was not conquered by a foreign king. It was foreclosed upon. The moment of its death happened in a quiet, air-conditioned room in Washington, D.C., and the weapon used to kill it wasn't a nuclear bomb or a tank division. It was a telephone call from the United States Treasury. This is the story of the Suez Crisis of 1956. To the historians of war, it is a story about a secret plot, a botched invasion, and a diplomatic humiliation. But to the historians of money, it is something far more significant. It was the moment when the world learned a brutal, undeniable lesson about the hierarchy of power in the modern age. It was the moment when the United States weaponized the dollar to destroy its closest ally, proving once and for all that military might is nothing without financial independence. To understand how Great Britain walked into this lethal trap, we have to strip away the nostalgia and look at the cold, hard reality of London in the 1950s. On the surface, Britain still looked like a titan. King George VI and then Queen Elizabeth II reigned over a dominion that covered a quarter of the globe. The Royal Navy still patrolled the oceans from the Falklands to Hong Kong. The pound sterling was still one of the world's two great reserve currencies, used to settle trade from Singapore to Jamaica. In the schoolrooms of England, children still looked at maps where huge swathes of the earth were painted pink, and they sang "Rule Britannia" with conviction. But this facade concealed a rotting financial interior. Britain had bankrupted itself fighting the Second World War. To defeat Hitler, the British had burned the furniture to heat the house. They had liquidated their massive overseas investments. They had sold off railways in Argentina and mines in Africa to pay for American steel and Canadian wheat. And when those assets were gone, they turned to borrowing. By 1945, Britain was the world's largest debtor. The economy was fragile, held together by a complex, teetering financial web known as the sterling area. Countries within the British Empire kept their national savings in London, in pounds. This gave Britain a pool of capital to use, a semblance of liquidity. But it also meant that the British economy was sitting on a trapdoor. If confidence in the pound ever collapsed, if those countries decided that the pound was unsafe and rushed to sell their sterling to buy dollars, the British economy would face a liquidity crisis that would make the Great Depression look like a picnic. The British government was terrified of this. Every Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer went to sleep at night worrying about the gold and dollar reserves. These reserves were the national savings account, the dam holding back the flood. They knew they were walking a tightrope. They needed to project strength to keep the value of the pound high. If they looked weak, the markets would panic, the reserves would drain away, and the empire would be insolvent. And the jugular vein of this fragile empire was the Suez Canal. Carved through the deserts of Egypt, linking the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, the canal was more than just a waterway. It was the economic lifeline of the United Kingdom. By 1956, two-thirds of the oil used in Britain passed through the canal. It was the highway to India, Australia, and the oil fields of the Persian Gulf. Without the canal, British industry would grind to a halt. The lights in London would go out. Technically, the canal was owned by the Suez Canal Company, a private corporation controlled by British and French shareholders. It was a remnant of the colonial age, a piece of Egypt that belonged to Europe. It was a state within a state, operating with its own laws and its own profits, most of which flowed north to Paris and London, bypassing the Egyptian people. For the British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, the canal was sacred. Eden was a man of the old school, an aristocrat and a diplomat who had lived through the trauma of the 1930s. He had seen what happened when the world appeased dictators like Mussolini and Hitler. He believed that aggressive nationalism had to be confronted, not indulged. And in 1956, he found his new dictator in Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser was the charismatic, fiery new president of Egypt. He represented the rising tide of Arab nationalism. He wanted to throw off the shackles of colonial rule. He wanted to modernize his country. His dream was to build the Aswan High Dam, a massive hydroelectric project that would electrify Egypt and control the flooding of the Nile. But dams cost money, and Egypt was poor. Initially, the United States and Britain promised to loan Nasser the money for the dam. They wanted to keep him in the Western camp during the Cold War. But Nasser was playing a dangerous game. He was flirting with the Soviet Union, recognizing communist China, and buying arms from Czechoslovakia. In July 1956, the United States, tired of Nasser's double-dealing, abruptly pulled the funding for the dam. Britain followed suit. Nasser was furious. He needed money to build his dream. If the West wouldn't give it to him, he would take it. On July 26, 1956, Nasser gave a speech in Alexandria. It was a passionate declaration of Arab independence, broadcast across the Middle East. In the middle of the speech, he uttered a specific code word, de lesseps. This was the signal for Egyptian troops to move. While Nasser spoke, soldiers seized the headquarters of the Suez Canal Company. They occupied the control towers and the offices. Nasser announced to the cheering crowds that he was nationalizing the canal. He would take the profits from the tolls and use them to build the Aswan Dam. He famously declared that they dug the canal with their lives, their skulls, their bones, and their blood. In London, the reaction was apocalyptic. Anthony Eden saw this not just as a theft of property, but as a hand closing around the windpipe of the British economy. If Nasser controlled the canal, he controlled the oil. If he controlled the oil, he could blackmail Britain. He could turn off the energy supply of the United Kingdom at a whim. Eden told his cabinet that Nasser was Mussolini. He believed that if Britain let Nasser get away with this, British prestige would collapse. The Sterling area countries would see that the British lion had no teeth. They would dump the pound. The financial house of cards would fall. Therefore, Eden concluded, Nasser had to be destroyed. But Britain had a problem. They couldn't just invade Egypt. It was 1956, not 1856. The world had changed. The United Nations Charter forbade wars of aggression. And more importantly, the President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, was strictly opposed to the use of force. Eisenhower was a military man, but he was also a pragmatist. He was facing an election year. He wanted stability in the Middle East, not a colonial war that would drive the Arabs into the arms of the Soviet Union. He warned Eden explicitly and repeatedly not to use force. He warned that the American public would not support it, and the financial consequences would be severe. Eden, blinded by pride, painkillers, and the trauma of the past, ignored the warning. He convinced himself that Eisenhower was just talking politics. He believed that once British troops were on the ground, the Americans would fall in line. He thought the special relationship between the US and UK was unbreakable. He thought that America would never let its old ally fail. He was wrong. He was about to discover that in the cold calculus of superpowers, there are no friends, only interests. Unable to invade openly because of American opposition, Britain hatched a secret, illegal plot. It was a conspiracy that would have shamed a mafia don. They teamed up with France, who also hated Nasser because he was supporting rebels in French Algeria, and they brought in a third partner, Israel. The plan was signed in secret at a private villa in Sevres, outside Paris. It was called the Protocol of Sevres. It remains one of the most cynical documents in diplomatic history. Here was the plan. Israel would invade Egypt across the Sinai Peninsula, aiming for the canal. This would look like a regional war between two old enemies. Then, Britain and France would issue an ultimatum to both sides, demanding they withdraw 10 miles from the canal zone to protect international shipping. When Nasser inevitably refused, Britain and France would invade. They would portray themselves not as aggressors, but as peacekeepers, saving the vital waterway from the chaos of war. They would seize the canal, topple Nasser, and restore the old order. It was a complex, elaborate lie designed to give Britain a pretext to retake its property without looking like a colonial bully. But while the generals plotted the troop movements and the diplomats polished the lies, the British Treasury was flashing red warning lights. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Harold Macmillan, was worried. He looked at the ledgers and saw weakness. The British gold and dollar reserves were dangerously low. They stood at about $2 billion. That sounds like a lot, but for a global reserve currency, it was the bare minimum needed to maintain confidence. Macmillan warned that a war would cost money. It would scare the markets. Speculators might sell the pound. He told Eden that they could only afford a war if the United States supported it, or at least tolerated it. If the U.S. opposed them, the financial pressure would be unbearable. Eden brushed these concerns aside. He was obsessed with the political objective. He believed that a quick, decisive victory would restore confidence in Britain. He thought that once the Union Jack was flying over Suez again, the markets would calm down, the oil would flow, and the pound would be stronger than ever. He was making the classic mistake of a declining power. He was betting his economy on a military gamble, assuming that the sword could fix the ledger. He didn't realize that he was walking into a trap where the battlefield was not the Sinai Desert, but the trading floors of New York and Zurich. The order was given. The secret protocol was activated. On October 29, 1956, Israeli paratroopers dropped into the Sinai. The war had begun, and the clock started ticking on the British economy. The lion was about to roar, but it had forgotten that it was the American eagle that paid for its food. The collision between the old empire of territory and the new empire of money was about to happen, and the result would change the world forever. On October 30th, 1956, the day after Israeli forces swept across the border into the Sinai Peninsula, the trap was sprung. In London and Paris, the diplomats drafted the document that was intended to justify the reconquest of the Suez Canal. They issued a joint ultimatum to both the Israeli and Egyptian governments. The terms were breathtaking in their cynicism. The ultimatum demanded that both sides withdraw their military forces 10 miles from the banks of the Suez Canal to guarantee the safety of international shipping. To the casual observer in the West, it might have sounded like a neutral peacekeeping measure, but to Gamal Abdel Nasser in Cairo, it was a gangster's demand. The ultimatum required the Egyptian army to retreat from its own sovereign territory, abandoning the Sinai to the invading Israelis, while allowing British and French troops to occupy the Canal Zone, the very soil Egypt had just nationalized. It was a demand for surrender dressed up as a request for a ceasefire. Nasser, of course, rejected it immediately. He knew exactly what this was, a coordinated colonial invasion. When the 12-hour deadline expired on October 31st, the pretense of diplomacy ended. The Royal Air Force launched Operation Musketeer. British bombers taking off from airfields in Cyprus and Malta roared over the Mediterranean. They pounded Egyptian airfields, destroying the Egyptian Air Force on the ground before it could even scramble. It was a display of overwhelming old-school imperial power. The skies belonged to the British. At sea, a massive armada of aircraft carriers, battleships and cruisers steamed toward Port Said. On the ground, Israeli tanks were slicing through the Egyptian defenses in the Sinai with terrifying speed. From a purely military perspective, the operation was flawless. The plan was working perfectly. But the British government had made a fatal miscalculation. They were fighting a 19th century war in a 20th century world. They assumed that military victory would silence their critics. They believed that once the Union Jack was raised over Port Said, the world would accept the fait accompli. They were wrong. In the arena of global opinion, Britain had walked into a minefield. The timing could not have been worse. While British bombs were falling on Cairo, Soviet tanks were rolling into the streets of Budapest to crush the Hungarian Revolution. The Western powers had been preparing to condemn the Soviet brutality, to take the moral high ground in the Cold War. But now, Britain and France, the supposed champions of democracy and international law, were behaving exactly like the Soviets, invading a sovereign nation to seize property. The United Nations exploded in outrage. For the first time in the history of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union voted together. They both condemned the invasion. The Soviet premier, Nikolai Bulganin, went even further. He sent a terrifying diplomatic note to London. He threatened to use all types of modern destructive weapons against London and Paris if they did not withdraw. It was a thinly veiled threat of nuclear war. In London, the mood shifted from a jingoistic pride to genuine fear. People began digging trenches in their gardens. The newspapers screamed about the possibility of a World War III starting over a canal in Africa. But the real threat to Britain wasn't coming from the Soviet missiles. It was coming from the trading floors of New York. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was furious. He felt personally betrayed by Anthony Eden. He had warned the British explicitly not to use force. He had been kept in the dark about the secret protocol with Israel and France. He saw the invasion as a reckless colonial adventure that threatened to push the entire Arab world into the arms of the communists, just days before he faced the American electorate. Eisenhower decided to teach the British a lesson they would never forget. He didn't order the U.S. Navy to intercept the British fleet. He didn't threaten to bomb London. He simply picked up the phone and called his Secretary of the Treasury, George Humphrey. The order was simple: break the pound. The American financial attack began quietly, but with devastating effectiveness. It was a new kind of warfare, invisible to the soldiers on the ground, but lethal to the state that sent them. The Federal Reserve and private American banks began to sell off their holdings of British pounds. They dumped sterling onto the global markets in massive quantities. At the same time, speculators in Zurich, Paris, and New York smelled blood. They saw that Britain was fighting a war it couldn't afford, against the wishes of the world's economic superpower. They panicked. Everyone wanted to get out of sterling and into dollars. The value of the pound began to plummet. Under the rules of the fixed exchange rate system, the Bank of England was legally obliged to defend the value of the currency. They had to buy up the pounds that everyone else was selling. To do this, they had to use their precious reserves of gold and US dollars. The drain was catastrophic. Britain was losing millions of dollars in reserves every single day. The National Savings Account, the funds needed to buy food and fuel for the population, was bleeding out. In the cabinet war rooms in London, the atmosphere shifted from confidence to terror. The military reports coming across the desks were excellent. The paratroopers had landed, Port Said was being captured, the road to Suez was open, but the financial reports were a disaster. Harold Macmillan, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, watched the ticker tape with growing horror. He saw the reserves dropping toward the critical $2 billion mark. He knew the mechanics of collapse better than anyone. He knew that once the reserves hit zero, the pound would have to be devalued or floated. If that happened, the sterling area would disintegrate. Britain would be unable to import wheat to make bread. The economy would stop. The government would fall. Desperate, Macmillan tried to arrange a lifeline. Britain was a founding member of the International Monetary Fund, IMF. They had significant funds on deposit there. It was their money, and they had the right to withdraw it in an emergency. Macmillan contacted the IMF headquarters in Washington to request an immediate withdrawal of $561 million. It was a massive sum, enough to stabilize the markets and pay for the war. But the IMF didn't answer to London. It answered to Washington. When the British representatives made the request, they were met with a stone wall. The U.S. Treasury officials, acting on direct orders from the White House, told the British that the loan was on hold. They were blunt. They said that the United States would block any financial assistance to the United Kingdom until a ceasefire was ordered and the troops were withdrawn. Then Eisenhower twisted the knife. He let it be known through diplomatic back channels that if Britain didn't stop the war, the U.S. government would begin selling its own massive holdings of British government bonds. This would trigger a sovereign default. It would bankrupt the British government instantly. It was financial blackmail on a global scale. The United States was holding a gun to the head of the British economy. On November 6, 1956, the British cabinet met in London. It was one of the most dramatic meetings in British history. Outside, the news was victorious. British paratroopers were advancing down the canal. They were only a few days away from seizing the entire waterway. They were winning the war. But inside the room, Harold Macmillan dropped the bombshell. He stood up and told the Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, that the country was technically insolvent. He said they had gold reserves for maybe a few more days. After that, they could not pay for their imports. They could not pay for the oil. They could not defend the currency. The choice was stark. They could have the Suez Canal, or they could have a functioning economy. They could not have both. Anthony Eden was broken. He was a sick man, his body pumped full of amphetamines to keep him awake and painkillers to manage the agony of a botched gallstone operation. He had staked his entire career, his reputation, and his country's honor on this operation. He believed he was fighting a new Hitler in Nasser. He believed he was saving the soul of the empire. But he couldn't fight the dollar. The logic of money overrode the logic of war. The cabinet looked at the figures. They realized that without American financial support, the British pound would become worthless paper within the week. They voted to accept a ceasefire. The order went out to the troops in Egypt. The British commander on the ground, General Stockwell, was stunned. He was winning. He had the Egyptians on the run. His tanks were ready to roll south. And now he was being told to stop his tanks just 23 miles short of the final objective. At midnight on November 6th, the guns fell silent. Operation Musketeer had lasted just a few days. Britain had humiliated Nasser militarily, destroying his air force and army. But Nasser had destroyed Britain politically and financially. The humiliation was total. The British Empire, which had once defied Napoleon and Hitler, had been brought to its knees by a run on the bank. They had been forced to stop a successful military campaign because their credit card was declined. But the pain wasn't over. The ceasefire was just the first step. Eisenhower wasn't satisfied with a pause. He wanted a surrender. He demanded a total, unconditional withdrawal of all British and French troops from Egypt. Until the troops left, the financial blockade would continue. The British tried to negotiate. They wanted guarantees. They wanted the canal to remain under international control. They wanted Nasser to make concessions. They wanted to save face. But they had no leverage. Because during the fighting, Gamal Abdel Nasser had played his ace card. He had given the order to sabotage the Suez Canal. The Egyptian Navy had sunk 47 ships, cement carriers, old barges, dredgers, right in the mouth of the waterway. They had physically blocked the canal with wreckage. The artery of the British Empire was severed. The oil tankers from the Persian Gulf could no longer get to Britain. They had to go all the way around Africa, a journey that took weeks longer and cost a fortune. Britain needed oil, and the only place to get oil quickly was from the United States. But Eisenhower refused to send oil. He famously said that those who started this war must boil in their own oil. The British people began to feel the pinch. The reality of their economic fragility was coming home. Petrol rationing was introduced. The motor fuel rationing order was passed. Every car owner in Britain was issued coupons. Driving became a luxury. Factories that relied on oil began to slow down. The heating in homes was turned down. The reserves continued to drain away. The country was shivering in the early winter cold, defeated and broke. The special relationship was exposed as a myth. Britain was not an equal partner to the United States. It was a client state. It was a junior partner that existed only as long as it followed the rules set by Washington. In the end, Britain capitulated completely. On December 3rd, 1956, the British government announced that it would withdraw all troops from Egypt without conditions. The moment the announcement was made, the financial tap was turned back on. The U.S. Treasury approved the IMF loan. The Federal Reserve stopped selling pounds. The oil tankers began to sail from Texas. The crisis was over, but the world had changed. The Suez Crisis proved that the age of European empires was dead. It proved that in the 20th century, you didn't need a navy to project power. You needed a reserve currency. The British soldiers came home angry and confused. They hadn't lost a battle, but they had lost the war. They had been defeated by the weaponized dollar. Anthony Eden, the prime minister, was ruined. His health collapsed along with his reputation. In January 1957, he resigned, a broken man who would go down in history as the leader who presided over the final sunset of the British Empire. But the economic consequences of Suez would last far longer than Eden's career. The crisis had exposed the fundamental weakness of the British economy. It showed the world that the pound sterling was vulnerable. It shattered the confidence of the sterling area countries. They began to realize that keeping their money in London was risky. The slow, painful decline of the pound had begun. The imperial preference trade system began to unravel. The colonies looked at the weakness of the mother country and accelerated their demands for independence. Suez was the psychological tipping point. Before 1956, the British believed they were a superpower. After 1956, they knew they were just an island off the coast of Europe, dependent on the goodwill of America to pay their bills. The weaponized dollar had done its job. It had cleared the board of old rivals. The British Empire was foreclosed, and the American Empire had officially taken over the lease. The military phase of the Suez operation had lasted exactly 42 hours. But the financial war, the war that actually mattered, was just entering its most brutal and decisive phase. On the morning of November 7th, 1956, the British government found itself in a purgatory of its own making. The ceasefire had been called. The paratroopers were stopped in the sand, just miles short of their objectives. But the United States was not satisfied. President Eisenhower did not just want the shooting to stop, he wanted the British to leave. And until they left, he was determined to keep his foot on the throat of the British economy. The weapon he used was the continued run on the pound. In the 1950s, the value of the British pound was fixed at $2.80. This wasn't just a number, it was a symbol of national virility and imperial stability. To maintain this rate, the Bank of England had to use its reserves of gold and dollars to buy up any pounds being sold on the open market. Eisenhower's Secretary of the Treasury, George Humphrey, orchestrated a silent, invisible assault. He signaled to the New York markets that the U.S. did not support the pound. The selling pressure became a torrent. Inside the Bank of England, the traders were overwhelmed. They were burning through millions of dollars an hour just to keep the price at $2.80. It was a financial hemorrhage. The national savings, accumulated over centuries, were draining away into the pockets of Swiss and American speculators. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Harold Macmillan, watched the numbers with terror. He calculated that at the current rate of loss, the British Empire would be bankrupt in 3 weeks. They would have zero foreign currency left. They wouldn't be able to buy wheat, meat, or sugar. The island nation, which imported 50% of its food, would face actual starvation. Desperate, Macmillan tried to activate Britain's emergency lifeline. Britain was a founding member of the International Monetary Fund, IMF. They had a right to withdraw their own funds, a tranche of $561 million. It was their money. Macmillan sent a delegation to Washington to withdraw the cash. When the British officials arrived at the IMF headquarters, they were met not by bankers, but by a political wall. The U.S. representative to the IMF had received a direct order from the White House: block the loan. The Americans told the British bluntly that they would not get a single cent from the IMF until they agreed to an unconditional withdrawal of all troops from Egypt. It was a shocking breach of protocol. The IMF was supposed to be apolitical, but the U.S. had proven that international institutions were weapons of American foreign policy. Britain was being blackmailed with its own money. But the financial siege was only half the story. The other half was physical. During the invasion, Gamal Abdel Nasser had played his ace card. He had given the order to sabotage the Suez Canal. The Egyptian Navy had sunk 47 ships, cement carriers, old barges, dredgers, right in the mouth of the waterway. They had physically blocked the canal with wreckage. The artery of the British Empire was severed. The oil tankers from the Persian Gulf could no longer get to Britain. They had to go all the way around Africa, a journey that took weeks longer and cost a fortune. Britain needed oil. And the only place to get oil quickly was from the United States. But Eisenhower refused to send oil. He famously told his aides that those who started this war must boil in their own oil. The impact on the British street was immediate. The government was forced to introduce strict petrol rationing. The motor fuel rationing order was passed. Every car owner in Britain was issued coupons. Driving became a luxury. The streets of London emptied of cars. Factories that relied on oil for heating or power began to shut down. The winter of 1956 was setting in, and the country was cold, dark, and immobile. The psychological effect was devastating. The British people had been told they were conquering heroes, reclaiming the canal. Instead, they were shivering in their homes, unable to drive to work, realizing that their government was powerless to secure the basic necessities of life. Inside 10 Downing Street, Prime Minister Anthony Eden was collapsing. The stress of the invasion, combined with the shame of the American rebuke, destroyed his health. He was living on a cocktail of benzedrine to stay awake and barbiturates to sleep. He was becoming paranoid, ranting about Nasser and the Soviets. On November 23rd, Eden effectively abandoned his post. He flew to Jamaica to recover his health, leaving the shipwreck of his government in the hands of his rival, Harold Macmillan. It was Macmillan, the Chancellor, who finally had to look the British Empire in the eye and tell it the truth. He convened a secret cabinet meeting. He laid out the spreadsheets. He showed the ministers the dwindling gold reserves. He showed them the oil stocks. He told them that they could stay in Suez and become a third world nation, or they could leave and save the pound. The choice was no choice at all. The dream of imperial power shattered against the hard rock of accounting. On December 3rd, 1956, the British Foreign Secretary stood up in the House of Commons. The chamber was silent. He announced that Her Majesty's government had agreed to withdraw all troops from Egypt without conditions. They had not toppled Nasser. They had not secured the canal. They had not guaranteed international control. They were simply leaving. It was the first time in history that a British army had retreated from a combat zone without being defeated in battle. They had been undefeated by the Egyptians, but they had been totally defeated by the dollar. The moment the announcement was made, the American financial war ended instantly. The phone rang in the Treasury. The U.S. approved the IMF loan. The Federal Reserve stopped selling pounds. The oil tankers in Texas raised their anchors and set sail for Southampton. The British economy was saved. The pound stabilized. The lights stayed on. But the price was the soul of the nation. The Suez syndrome infected the British psyche. The people realized that their independence was a sham. They realized that Great Britain was no longer a superpower. It was a client state of the United States. It existed only on American sufferance. The soldiers returning from Egypt were angry and confused. They were jeered by the Egyptian crowds as they boarded the ships. They left behind the toppled statue of Ferdinand de Lesseps, the builder of the canal, lying in the dirt, a symbol of the end of the European era in the Middle East. But the final act of this tragedy was yet to come. The financial crisis had exposed the rot, but the political consequences would reshape the entire global order. Britain had to find a new role in the world, now that empire was no longer an option. And the man who had pushed for the war, Anthony Eden, had one final humiliation to face. On January 9th, 1957, Sir Anthony Eden went to Buckingham Palace to offer his resignation to Queen Elizabeth II. He was the first British Prime Minister to be forced out of office not by the voters, not by his party, but by a currency crisis. He left 10 Downing Street a broken man, his health shattered and his reputation in ruins. He had tried to be the last lion of the British Empire, but he had been brought down by the cold, hard logic of the ledger. His successor was Harold Macmillan, the very man who, as Chancellor, had told the cabinet that the country was broke. Macmillan was a realist. He understood what Eden had refused to accept, that the game was up. Britain could no longer pretend to be a superpower on the cheap. The immediate financial panic of November 1956 had subsided. The American loans were flowing, the oil was moving again, and the pound was stable at 280s. But the Suez Crisis had inflicted a deep, invisible wound on the British economy that would never truly heal. The crisis had shattered the sterling area. For decades, the countries of the British Empire, from Malaya to Ghana to Kuwait, had kept their national savings in London, in pounds. They essentially lent money to Britain to help it function. It was a system built on trust. Trust that the pound was as good as gold, and trust that Britain was the ultimate guarantor of their security. Suez destroyed that trust. The leaders of these nations watched as the British economy nearly collapsed in a week because the Americans sold a few bonds. They realized that their money wasn't safe in London. They realized that the British lion was living on an American allowance. Slowly, quietly, the money began to leave. Kuwait, a massive oil producer, started shifting its reserves into US dollars and Swiss francs. Other colonies followed suit. The pool of capital that had kept the British economy afloat for a century began to evaporate. The City of London, once the banker to the world, was demoted to a regional branch manager. This financial reality forced a total geopolitical rethink. Harold Macmillan, now Prime Minister, looked at the balance sheet of the empire and realized it was a liability. Garrisoning troops in Kenya, Cyprus, and Aden cost millions of pounds a year. Building roads and schools in the colonies cost millions more. In the old days, the trade profits justified the expense. But in the post-Suez world, where the pound was weak and the economy was fragile, the empire was a luxury item that Britain could no longer afford. This was the economic engine behind the wind of change. In 1960, Macmillan gave a famous speech in South Africa where he acknowledged that the desire for independence was sweeping the continent. But behind the soaring rhetoric was a cold calculation. Britain began to liquidate its empire not just for moral reasons, but for fiscal ones. They granted independence to Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Tanganyika, and Uganda in rapid succession. It was a fire sale. Britain was shedding assets to cut costs. The retreat from empire was, at its core, a desperate attempt to balance the budget. But stripping away the colonies wasn't enough. Britain needed a new economic future. The island nation couldn't survive on its own. It needed a market. It needed a partner. Having been humiliated by the Americans and having lost the empire, Britain turned to the only place left, Europe. It was the ultimate irony. For centuries, British foreign policy had been based on staying aloof from the European continent. But now, destitute and isolated, Britain went cap in hand to the newly formed European Economic Community, the precursor to the EU. They applied for membership in 1961. They were desperate to join the trade bloc to revitalize their stagnant industries, but they faced one final humiliation. The French president, Charles de Gaulle, remembered how Britain had acted during Suez, impulsive, subservient to America, and financially unstable. De Gaulle said, "Non." He vetoed British membership. He slammed the door in Britain's face. It would take another decade before Britain was finally allowed into the European club. By then, the transformation was complete. The global empire was gone, replaced by a medium-sized European nation struggling with inflation, strikes, and a currency that would eventually have to be devalued again and again. The Suez Crisis was the pivot point of the 20th century for Britain. It was the moment the hangover of World War II finally cleared. And the British people looked in the mirror and saw who they really were. They were not Romans. They were not the masters of the globe. They were a debtor nation living in a drafty house, trying to keep up appearances. But the lesson of Suez goes beyond Britain. It is a lesson about the nature of power in the modern world. Before 1956, power was measured in battleships, tank divisions, and square miles of territory. If you had the biggest navy, you were the superpower. After 1956, power was measured in currency reserves, bond yields, and trade deficits. President Eisenhower proved that you don't need to bomb a country to defeat it. You don't need to invade it. You just need to control its currency. By weaponizing the dollar, the United States established a hegemony far more efficient than any empire that came before it. The Romans needed legions to occupy Gaul. The British needed gunboats to control India. The Americans only needed the Federal Reserve. When the U.S. threatened to crash the pound, they didn't just stop a war, they established the rules of the Pax Americana. The rule was simple. You can have your flag, your anthem, and your army. But if you cross the United States, your money will turn to dust. We see this weapon used again and again in the decades that followed. We saw it used against the Soviet Union in the 1980s, forcing them into bankruptcy. We see it used today in the form of sanctions, SWIFT bans, and asset freezes. The financial warfare that was pioneered in November 1956 has become the primary way superpowers fight in the 21st century. The British soldiers who shivered in the trenches of the Sinai in 1956 were the first victims of this new kind of war. They won every firefight, captured every objective, and displayed every ounce of courage asked of them. But they were defeated by a force they couldn't shoot. Anthony Eden died in 1977. He spent the last 20 years of his life trying to justify his actions, writing memoirs that insisted he had been right to stand up to Nasser. But he never fully grasped the economic reality that destroyed him. He died believing he was a casualty of politics, when in fact he was a casualty of accounting. Today, the Suez Canal flows quietly through the Egyptian desert. It is owned and operated by Egypt. The statue of Ferdinand de Lesseps is long gone. The British bases are dust. But in the computer servers of New York, London, and Tokyo, the legacy of 1956 lives on. Every time a nation checks its foreign currency reserves before making a diplomatic decision, every time a leader worries about a credit rating downgrade, and every time a sanction is threatened, the ghost of the Suez Crisis is in the room. It was the moment the world learned that while the sword is mighty, the dollar is almighty. This concludes the story of the weaponized dollar. It is a story not of a battle lost, but of an illusion shattered. It is the story of how the bank balance of an empire finally reached zero. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.